Hi, Misha here, and we've covered the Grumman F-14 Tomcat before, but it's been a while, and haven't gone over it with the new camera, so let's do it again. Kind of making the big ultimate Tomcat video, although probably not going to be heavily technical because I don't want to be here an hour, and neither do you. We'll see if that actually comes true. So again, I have Hobby Master models. On the far right, we have a very early F-14A from around 1975-76. Then we have an F-14A Plus, later known as F-14B, from the late 80s. Then we return to the F-14A, but a later version, later update, from the early 21st century, when the aircraft was fitted with some more abilities. And then finally, we have the F-14D, usually known as the Super Tomcat, and this was the final major production model, although they were only produced for a couple of years. And as for an F-14C, well, there never really was one. Kind of got canceled. Of course, this aircraft was born out of the needs of Vietnam and changing administrations in the 70s, served throughout the 80s, kind of had a second lease on life and a redefinition of its role in the 90s, and was used during the early so-called War on Terror in Afghanistan and Iraq between 2001 and 2006. And as you know, the Tomcat is probably most famous for its role in Top Gun. And maybe one day, 1 year, Top Gun Maverick will be out. And so with that in mind, let's talk about the Tomcat. So our first example on the spinny thingy, like I said, is an early U.S. Navy F-14A, circa mid-1970s, and I have it in a very common kind of Cold War loadout here. And there's an easy way to tell this is an early one, which I'll mention in a bit. Yeah, this began in the 1960s. Back then, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom was the Navy's primary fighter, interceptor, and even the ground attacker, although the A-6 and A-7 played roles and so on and so forth, and the U.S. Air Force adopted it. Well, the counterpoint to that, when the Navy was looking for its next fleet interceptor, fleet interdictor, it was supposed to, according to the Kennedy administration, go with the F-111, later known as the Aardvark. This was primarily designed, at least in the beginning, for the Air Force, but a navalized version was known as the F-111B. New engines were developed for it, known as the TF-30 engines, and a new missile, which would become the AIM-54 Phoenix. And the F-111B, well, the whole F-111 series, was a swing wing design, and it would have been the largest aircraft to operate from not just a U.S. carrier, but of course any carrier in the world. But the project had lots of problems, and much as the British did with their F-111Ks, the Navy was very dissatisfied. So much so that in 1966, they kind of tasked Grumman with just a test, a little experiment. We're not going to buy this. Just, if you could come up with a new fleet interceptor, interdictor with potentially a secondary ground attack role. Yeah, just kind of play with it. In 1967, Grumman kind of came back with a basic proposal. And Grumman had been a junior partner working on the Aardvark as well. Well, finally, in May of '68, Congress relented and cut funding for the F-111B project. Now, normally, a military branch would not like funding being cut, But in this instance, it actually freed them up just a couple months later to unveil the VFX, or Naval Fighter Experimental Program, really to come up with the replacement for the F-4 Phantom. And by that December, 2 finalists were selected. We had McDonnell Douglas and Grumman. And already right after New Year, in January of 1969, the Grumman design was chosen. It originally started off as the Model 303, and then once it was accepted, it was known as the YF-14A. At least the first 12 or so were this. Now, YF is usually a pre-production, but usually have an experimental model. Well, to kind of cut down time and politicking, the whole prototype phase was just dropped. Instead, it was just straight up ordered into production. To that end, the first YF-14A flew on December 21st, 1970, which was less than 2 years after the design was initially created. So, pretty darn impressive turnaround. From there, of course, they had to work out a few kinks, but nothing too severe, and it was ready for primetime service in 1973. And actually, the U.S. Marines were going to consider adopting it, but that secondary ground attack ability was never expanded upon. Much like the Air Force's F-15 of the same era, this was a pure air-to-air jet fighter with a need for speed. And the first ones were ready and entering into fleet service on September 22nd, 1974, and would quickly phase in, replacing the F-4. They were up to the J and later the N variants by this point. So with that, features. Now this is a 1/72 scale diecast from Hobbymaster. It's mostly metal, pretty large. The original aircraft was just under 63 feet long. And with the wings swept back like this, it had a span of about 38 feet. But when you were to sweep them forward, of course this is going to make it weird on the stand now, because, yeah. Now we're about as wide as we are long, and it's 64 feet. The wings could retract from 20 degrees to 68 degrees, and could actually kind of fold back. And this wasn't for flight, but you could push them back even further for like deck storage and whatnot. See there where they kind of lap over with the horizontals. But typically in flight they wouldn't go any further back than about there. Now when they're all the way back, that's kind of a dash, high speed, high performance. All the way forward would be kind of lower speed maneuvering, takeoff, landing, and then midpoint would be kind of a cruise mode in between the two. Also on this model, it's kind of neat, the horizontals move and move independently, so that's kind of a nice control surface, and they're not loose or floppy. Of course, we have 2 horizontals, 2 verticals, and we have the TF-30 engine originally developed for the F-111B aardvark, which actually would kind of come to plague this craft. And under the fuselage here, you'll see 2 big old finned missiles. These are the long-range, and at the time very advanced, AIM-54 Phoenix. And these 2 were originally developed for the aardvark, but would appear on the Tomcat here. By the way, Grumman likes giving its aircraft cat names. Now, as I said, this one's kind of configured in a Cold War fleet intercept configuration with two Phoenix in the center there. Now, oftentimes it would have two drop tanks under the engines, but I just wanted this one more clean, so I didn't put them on. And then on these little gloves here, we have two medium-range Sparrows, AIM-7s, and two short-range AIM-9 Sidewinders. So 222, plus in the back, which you probably can't see, but behind these Phoenix, there's one more AIM-7 Sparrow. So one of the major Cold War configurations was 3 Sparrows, 2 Phoenix, 2 Sidewinder. On top of that, it had an M61 20mm cannon with about 675 rounds. And that really gets us to a point. This was based on lessons learned. Whereas the U.S. Air Force's F-4 would get a cannon with the F-4E, the Navy's F-4J would not. It would have a cannon pod sometimes, but not a cannon. But this time they were going to integrate a cannon for dogfighting, or, more often, to fire warning shots. And of course, it was designed to be faster, more maneuverable, and for a naval aircraft to have longer range, more endurance than the F-4. And really it achieves all of these goals. But it was not without its problems. We have a crew of 2, pilot, and then we have the radar intercept officer, the RIO, in the back. Theoretically, maximum top speed was Mach 2.34, although rarely they would achieve this. Of course, they would have full afterburner capability. And depending on the version, altitude was about 50,000 to not quite 60,000 feet, later versions. Likewise, earlier versions like this A carried about 13,000 pounds maximum. This would severely impact duration, though. Later versions would be almost 15,000 pounds thanks to improvements in better engines. And when this went into service, it was definitely the largest jet fighter to operate from a carrier. Not as big as the F-14B would have been, but still huge by the standards of the day, especially at a time when a lot of militaries like Britain were downsizing, going to the Harrier from larger craft. And it was quite versatile. Again, it only carried air-to-air, and it was really these 3 weapons, the AIM-7, AIM-9, and AIM-54, plus drop tanks, had a total of 10 hardpoints, but it's a little illusory because you couldn't use all 10 under the fuselage. You have some limits. You can have the 2 Phoenix in the front. You can't actually have 2 Phoenix in the back and not in the front. The way these pads that they operate, or pallets they call them, operate the wiring, you have to have them in the front. Now you can, if you put them in the front, also have them in the back. It's a thing, whatever, doesn't really matter. And on the wings here, on the outer ones, you're pretty much stuck with these short or medium range, although theoretically these could carry 6 AIM-54s, 4 in the root there in the tunnel, and then 2 on the inner wing globe points with 2 AIM-9s on the outer. But this was basically never done outside of training or practice or testing because it was extremely heavy. It was very hard for this to take off from the deck. And much like an aircraft, an airframe that has flight hours, missiles do too. And the Phoenix was a very expensive missile. So why put wear and tear when you really weren't going to use them? So with that, yeah, production began and would run through the 1970s. But even when the F-14 was coming into service, that original TF-30 engine, it wasn't great. Early ones, they had some burnout problems, they had some stalling. It really was kind of underpowered for what it was. Higher altitude over, say, 30,000, 40,000 feet performance wasn't great. and usually required full afterburner to take off the deck, especially when an aircraft was fully laden. So they were working on an improved version of this engine already before this was even officially in service. So with that, let's move on to the Reagan era. The F-14A+, retroactively kind of named the F-14B in May of 1991. Now, at the beginning I said there's kind of a way to tell an early F-14. You'll notice that there is a tube sticking out of the nose on this one. Many would think it is a pitot tube. It's not. It's actually an angle of attack sensor, which assists with improved handling during landings and combat maneuvering and things of that nature. Now, if you look at mine over here, you might have thought the tube has just been broken off. Not a bad assumption considering how fragile things can be. But actually, no. The first generation of F-14s were not equipped with that sensor. It would be added later. And also, even though the first 480 some odd were the F-14As, with, you know, 12 being the YF-14A before that, the last 100, 102 in this series actually had an improved version of the TF-30 engine. It didn't address all the problems, but it did improve reliability a smidgen. But work continued, and finally of 1987, this version first took to the sky. And this finally gets rid of those engines, replacing them with the new GF-110 GE400 engines. You'll notice the exhaust is a different shape. And these were a great improvement. You had better climb, better endurance, better lift, much more reliability, addressed a lot of those issues, and best of all, you didn't have to take off from the deck with afterburner. You could just take off. Although when they were fully loaded up, they tended to still use afterburner to give them a safety margin. Again, originally known as the F-14A+, this did have a newer kind of early warning radar system, a few other jamming systems, but otherwise the avionics were mostly unchanged from the A, as was the radar. And they would produce 38 new airframes in the F-14A+, F-14B series, and they would update about 48 original F-14As to this new standard. And these were in service in time for the first Gulf War. But they had been used throughout the 80s in different engagements in the Persian Gulf era and region. Now, this one does have the two Phoenix here. I wish I could show you better the thing here. In fact, let me risk taking this off the stand. Hopefully this doesn't end in tears for me. These are pretty stable models, but still, on camera the weirdest things happen. Now I gotta find where I put the camera. See, this is why blind people don't take things off stands. You'll see that there are the three Phoenix, and there's also a pod on the starboard rear there. That's where it was carried. That is the TARPS, the Tactical Air Reconnaissance Pod System. It's a very interesting device. In fact, it was the largest device ever carried by the Tomcat. It was 17 feet long and weighed nearly a ton, like 1,800 some odd pounds. This is a camera pod with 3 major bays designed to take pictures of terrain. This is the first time they're starting to kind of use the Tomcat is a multi-role, or at least more than one role craft. You can also see the two drop tanks here under the wings. I put these on this one for kind of a long-range deal. Plus, it's got the near engines. It's thirsty. The TARPS pod was kind of an intermediate stopgap measure. They wanted to retire the RA-5C, the Vigilante, which is a large and kind of dated aircraft. They retired it out around 1979. It had been the Navy's reconnaissance craft. So they made this pod for the F-14. It's just an interim solution until the FA-18 could have a reconnaissance variant. And it was kind of rushed into Fleet Navy service in 1981. And it was used on the F-14A and also later F-14B, but they actually had to modify the aircraft. They had to change up the wiring so that the Rio in the back seat here could get a control panel for the TARPS pod. So they had to kind of rewire the aircraft, change a few things, and therefore the craft were kind of semi-permanent as reconnaissance at this point. And they would start flying these, and then there would be a mission over Lebanon, and they realized that the way the cameras worked, it made the Tomcat have to go kind of lower and slower than it liked, and it kind of showed that the newer Soviet SAM missiles were able to catch up with it. So after this, the TARPS pod itself was updated, but they also updated the countermeasures. More chaff was incorporated, and various kind of jamming systems were incorporated ad hoc early on with the F-14A. And so when it came time for the A+, a lot of these things were standardized. So that's why the version here has updated kind of countermeasures and defensive things. These stands hold them better than you would think, but you gotta kind of get it in the right spots. It's a 3-point stand, so once it's seated, as heavy as this craft is, it's one of the better Hobbymaster stands, and it has a metal stem and wide base. But if this is not seated properly, you could thump your plane, and that's no bueno. And I really would have a broken sensor tube. Hey, wings. And these are actually keyed together too, the wings on this model, so if you move one, the other moves. But again, the horizontals back here are separate from each other. As with other Hobbymasters, of course, you do have an opening canopy. You can take a gander at Goose in the back there. The crew members are removable. And this does have slightly different sensors and antennae compared with the early ones. And one thing I like about the Hobbymasters, all these little things sticking out, they're actually made of kind of flexible rubber, which is good because if they were plastic or even metal, they would probably snap off even at distant shipping. So yeah, I've got this one set up in a TARPS configuration, but they still would carry Phoenix and other missiles because it was still a dogfighter at heart. You just can't take it out of the Tomcat. But still, it was an air-to-air aircraft, and still it was used in the first Gulf War, 1991. It was used to fly CAP, Combat Air Patrol, to provide support and to provide escort. But the Cold War would soon be ending. And so having a dedicated air-to-air fighter would seem less than useful. Something the U.S. Air Force was learning with the F-15 as well, which would kind of culminate in the Strike Eagle. What was the Navy to do? Well, there were several plans on the table. And as we said from the very beginning, there was at least the notion that this should have a secondary ground attack role, although it was never expanded upon during the 70s and 80s. But the 90s, the decade of Slick Willie, different time. If you notice here, we're back to the TF30 exhaust nozzles, because this is an F-14A, although it has been updated, modified. Really right after the A+ program was complete, they started working on ways for the F-14 to carry a limited range of air-to-surface ordnance, iron bombs, as well as later guided munitions. And in 1992, so right after the Gulf War, the F-14 was cleared to carry air-to-surface, and throughout the 90s they would practice with it. And its first kind of major use was one of the very first aircraft in to provide strike missions over Afghanistan. It had the range, it had the speed, it was updated to carry 2 air-to-surface munitions on the front of the tunnel. I don't believe the back of the tunnel ever could carry these. I believe it was only the front. The back was either empty or would carry a Sparrow. Typically it would carry a Sparrow. I don't have one on this one. Don't think it's the one I have on. No, I don't. I have a little extra blue tack left over where I had one there. Instead, it carries the 2 sidewinders and 1 Sparrow on the wing. And instead, this one has a lantern pod where 1 Sparrow would be. Now, these are still able to carry the TARPS as well. It would actually, even though it was an interim solution, continue to carry it to the very end. So this is when the F-14 started to become a ground attacker, because frankly there just weren't that many air-to-air opponents for it to go up against at this point in time. And of course, with only 48 of the original F-14As converted to F-14B, that meant many of the A's were still A's, left with the engines, and they updated them as they could. It's also worth pointing out that in the late 90s, 67 of the existing F-14Bs were given an airframe service life extension, as well as updating some avionics. Remember, they had their pretty much original avionics. And this would be the F-14B mod, kind of to get the thing. And while the F-14As would not receive quite the service life extension program, because there never were enough Bs to go around, plenty of A's were still in the fleet. And would continue to be so. It's just now, instead of an air-to-air, they were a strike aircraft. But of course, they were still used for cap and other surface missions, and I do apologize for this one being super dusty. This is one of my older ones, and, well, it's spring here, and pollen is everywhere. Just pretend like it flew through a dust storm. This one's actually 2004 from one of the last cruises of the USS Enterprise, CVN 65. And I think this one actually might be for the Enterprise too, but one of the early cruises. And hopefully you can see kind of the early and late camo paint differences. Kind of neat, I think. As with most hobby masters, this also you can do, gear up or down, which is fun. It has a few different sensors, and actually the AOA sensor on the nose is slightly different here than on the first B. Just an overall very neat bird. And again, lots of metal on these. And with that, let's talk about the last member of the family. the F-14D, the last of the Tomcats. And it's certainly earns its name of Super Tomcat. It uses a further refinement of the GF-110 G400 engines. Very similar to what was found in the B, but a little bit better thrust. This has the highest carrying ability of any of the Tomcats, and it has the best high altitude performance. Unlike the A's and the B's that had to be modified to work with the TARPS pod, since these were produced last, all 14Ds could carry a TARPS pod. They also had many of the early warning updates of the B, and they had all new avionics for the most part, as well as a new digital glass cockpit, new jamming systems, and finally they have a new, improved, modernized, more powerful radar. Very important for an interceptor. So all around, a very polished aircraft, kind of really leaving all the problems of the first generation in the dust. And these were first tested and put into production in 1991, just in time for the U.S. Congress to cut the budget and kind of kill the program, meaning that the last of these rolled off the production line only a year later in 1992. They would only build 37 new F-14Ds. Actually, I think I'm wrong. 37, 38, something like that. Anyway, yeah, 37, I think. And then they would take 18 F-14As and update them to the F-14D standard, designating those as F-14DR, just to, differentiate. And for anyone that can do basic math, that's not a large number of aircraft, only 55 available. That meant that's kind of why we had the Bs that had to be updated in the 90s, the B mods, and why the A's had to be continually kept in service. And these are pretty much ready to go for ground attack, and could carry even newer laser guided like JDAM, Paveway, and they could carry heavier bombs, but again only in the front 2 points of the tunnel. The rear is either left void, or in this case it does have a Sparrow back here. So our loadout, 2 AIM-7s, 2 AIM-9s, and then we have a lantern pod under the wing, and then we have 2 guided munitions for it to strike a target with, so it can defend itself and drop munitions. And of course it carries the drop tanks. I kind of, as you can tell, 2 of mine have the tanks, 2 of them don't, just to kind of differentiate. And there's a little bit of difference in the kind of patterning of the antenna and stuff on these, little subtle differences, and including in the exhaust back here. And even the intake ramps are a little bit different. Devil's in the details with models, but that's what makes them fun. One thing, I said the wings were adjustable on the F-14. Typically this is done automatically by the computer to optimize for flight, but the pilot can override the computer and manually set them. This is an improvement over earlier swing wing designs and many of the early Russian swing wing designs that required the pilot to do it manually, which of course is just one more thing for the pilot to worry about. So yeah, these were produced in 91, 92, and were kept into fleet service. The F-14 would not only be used in Afghanistan. Once the Second Iraq War would begin in 2003, they would be used heavily there. In fact, this one and the last one are from that war. And they would continue to be on carriers, having cruises up to 2006. In July, they would go on their last cruise, kind of have their last carrier-based missions. And then in September of that year, they would have their official final flight. Actually, it was on September 22nd, 2006, meaning that it was 32 years to the day from when it was officially put into service. And why was it retired? I mean, some of these airframes are not even 15 years old. It's a very large aircraft. It took up a lot of space on the carrier deck, and it was getting expensive to run, getting harder to modernize. The production line at Grumman had been shut down. Of course, budget cuts in the 90s. Budgets kind of returned with the War on Terror, but nevertheless, by this point, the Navy was deciding to go to an all-Hornet fleet. You had the original FA-18, and then you had the FA-18 Super Hornet, as well as the FA-18 Growler. And that was the idea, go to an all-Hornet fleet. And of course, at this point, by 2006, the F-35C, the navalized version, was appearing on the horizon too. Of course, no one expected it to take another decade to get there, but it was decided to go ahead and remove the Tomcat, and they did. And did they put these in museums? No. Actually, in January of 2007, the U.S. government decided to shred virtually the entire Tomcat fleet. The original A's, the updated ones, the B's, even the relatively new D's. Why did they do this? It must be said that the last ones were sent to the shredder in 2009, so they were pretty aggressive. Well, that's because while the U.S. Navy was by far the primary user, it was not the only user. There was one export user. And with that, let's have a bonus Tomcat. Meet the F-14AM, or as I like to call it, the Camo Cat. I don't think anyone else does, though. The only foreign user of the Tomcat was the Iranian Air Force. And of course, most of you know exactly why, but some might think, why in the world will we sell Tomcats to the Iranian Republic, the Islamic State? Well, we didn't. We sold them to the Shah. Much like other allies, in the 1970s, they were worried about new Soviet aircraft, like the MiG-25. And in 1972, Nixon made a visit to the Imperial Iranian state, the Shah, and he offered them pretty much their pick of the litter for modern American technology and fighters. And they quickly decided either it was going to be the F-15 or the F-14. Grumman, seeing an opportunity, quickly arranged a demonstration for the Shah, which occurred, and in January of 1974, he ordered 30 F-14As and about 420 some odd Sparrow AIM-54 missiles for them. Plus, of course, I said Sparrow, I meant Phoenix. I've been doing this a while now. Plus, he would have got some Sparrows, too. That's the benefit of only needing to impress one person. You know, get the Shah on board, and you're good. But quickly, the contract was greatly expanded to 80 aircraft and over 700 Phoenix missiles, plus spare parts to service all planes for 10 years, and a training program for Iranian pilots, and an air base and facility set up by Grumman in Iran. So it was a big project. In fact, they basically made a city. The first ones were delivered in January of 1976, and deliveries would continue through 1977, 1978. And the Iranian Tomcat was virtually identical to the same ones being received by the U.S. Navy at the time, including the slightly updated F-30 engines. About the only things that were removed were some sensitive parts of the avionics, electronics, that kind of thing, computer systems, but these were in no way, shape, or form neutered. Again, they could operate the Phoenix missile. That's kind of interesting. Iran doesn't have aircraft carriers. This is very much a carrier-based aircraft. At first glance, you would think the very similarly performing F-15 might have suited their needs better, but again, the Grumman sales team did their job and sold them. And it would quickly come back to bite the U.S. in the ass. When the Shah was overthrown in 1979, the Iranian Air Force had received all but one of their 80 aircraft, meaning 79 fell into the hands of the Muslim fundamental state. And they put these to use. In fact, by 1980, they were using them in their war against Iraq, and for over half a year, they just dominated the skies. It was only after Iraq started receiving aid from the US, France, even Russia, that the tables were slightly evened out. But throughout the war, the Iranians would only lose 12 of their F-14s, and half of those were just to mechanical and other accidents. Only 5 or 6 were lost to Iraqi military assets. Counter that, the Iraqis lost about 160 aircraft to the F-14. Now, of course, not all were combat, but a large majority were. We're talking upwards of 100 MiGs, some Sukhois, and some other things, including some late Mirage F-1s that Iraq obtained in the last couple of years of the war. So these proved themselves very adequate. Really, the only problems began when spare parts started to run out, along with Phoenix missiles. By 1985, the Iranians were practicing and trying to figure out ways to get different missiles to work with the Tomcat, but this did not prove easy. The aircraft was designed for the Phoenix and the Sparrow, and so it was difficult to make Russian or French or other missiles work with it. But they kept trying and had some success with the different things. It doesn't really matter for this video. But at this point, the spare parts were running out, and so they really only had 30 or 40 aircraft that were combat capable at this point. Most of them hadn't been lost. They were just grounded for one reason or another. So after the war with Iraq, they did look for a way to update their aircraft. And this is why America shredded theirs. They were afraid that the Iranians would get their hands on the surplus U.S. aircraft, which actually was a warranted affair, because while they never got their hands on surplus missiles, even though the U.S. did shred their planes, somehow Iran managed to get spare parts and use them to kind of restore some of their planes. Around 2008, it was estimated that maybe fewer than 9 were airworthy, and this number would kind of slowly but gradually increase by 2012, 2014, to the point it's estimated that as many as 40 might be combat capable now, although some other sources say no, it's more like 20. And because the aircraft were getting old and had been used very actively in combat, they set about their own upgrade program, like America had done. This is where the F-14AM comes from here. Notice it has this kind of camo scheme. That was a new thing. They also did their best to extend the life of the airframes by strengthening and upgrading certain components. They also installed some locally made avionics and radar components, as well as sourcing spare parts from other foreign services that they could kind of get in country. And they continued working with different missiles, trying to make them go. Now this one here I have kind of laid out in an interesting configuration. I have the two AIM-9s on the outside, and then I have the two AIM-7s, but then here I have all four Sparrows, the two center line and then the two up front. I wanted a Tomcat set up like this. I just thought it would be neat to kind of show all of the missiles in the tunnel there. As for their Phoenixes, the original AIM-54s have pretty much all reached the end of their service life for Iran, but they've made various kind of hybrids, using components, guidance systems from other missiles, putting them in the casings of the Phoenix. It's kind of an interesting situation. And there were reports around 2015 of these being used to escort Russian bombers that were going at different targets in Syria. There's also accounts of these being used to go at various terrorist things. And it definitely seems like Iran has full plans to keep flying the Tomcat as long as they can. It's kind of funny, now they're the only user in the world, with America having retired theirs 15 years ago. And I just thought this was a really neat model from Hobbymaster. Again, it's very much similar, it just has the different paint scheme. And it does come with the Phoenix if you prefer, but I like it with all the Sparrows. Very much a loaded out configuration. Kind of this tri-Sparrow look in the front I really think is neat. What do you think? No lantern pods on these? Or any of the other kind of update for air-to-surface ordnance that were in the American aircraft? Nope. This is a F-14A. And there we have another update of the Tomcat. Hopefully the new camera lets you see something, more than me at any rate. Again, these are all 1/72 scale diecast from Hobbymaster. There are other brands that do the Tomcat, like Century Wings and Caliber, but I actually think the Hobbymaster is a good feature for cost ratio. They're pretty durable. They come with ordnance. In fact, the Super Tomcat comes with a ridiculous number of ordnance options. About 3 different air-to-surface missile sets. Plus, it still comes with the old Phoenix missiles and some Sparrows. The early one here, it just comes with either the Phoenix. You can lay it out however you want. The Iranian, it comes with a lot of Sparrows and 4 Phoenix. And moving over here to the B, pretty much you can do it with the TARP pod or without, and put a Phoenix in its place. And then this updated A, you can do pretty much how I have it configured. That it didn't come with a lot, but it's an early Hobbymaster model. That's kind of how their line works. The later in the line, it seems like the more accessories they include, I guess, to kind of entice people, and they've got more tooling they can utilize. But the Iranian one tends to be very popular because it's just an interesting take, and it is kind of in a way the last variant, because the AM is much newer than the others, even though it's just more of a chop job to keep the aircraft running. On the other hand, they most everything that the F-14 did, it was in the hands of the Iranian Air Force. I mean, the U.S. had a few things in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but nothing like what they did. So yeah, from 1969 through 1992, they built these planes. Numbers on totals are a little iffy. 712 is often repeated as the number produced, but then when I kind of add up the numbers, they don't add up. So I think that number is including the updated planes twice. So if you have an original A that's updated to say a D, that's counted as 2 planes. Just a theory, but anyway, not a large production run, especially for something in production for over 2 decades. But it's kind of funny how it changed pretty little. I mean, the engines were the big improvement, but the avionics and the radar and the weapons stayed good up through the 90s, and it wasn't until then that they finally kind of had to go to newer versions. They had changed a few other things like the ejection seat too, of course. Communications gears, GPS, things of that nature. But this is pretty much it as far as the variants. And I know there's not a lot of difference, but for what it's worth, which one of these 5 is your favorite? If nothing else, they do have different camo schemes, so there is that. And this really is kind of the naval equivalent to the Air Force's F-15, or later Soviet planes like the Sukhoi Su-27, Su-33. Alrighty guys, I really appreciate you hanging out with me a bit and talking Tomcats. And again, maybe one day we'll finally get Top Gun Maverick. Who knows at this point? Feel free to post, comment, send any questions. And as always, if you could like, share, and subscribe. I hope my camera work is getting somewhat better, or at least the camera's better. So hopefully you were able to enjoy this. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.